few housekeeping announcements before I introduce our presenters today. To download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other handouts, please use the handout pod in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Select the name of the handout you'd like to download and then click the Download Files button. You must enable your computer speakers prior to entering the event. If you have not been able to hear the audio, try logging out, turning on your speakers, and then logging back in. There is not a conference number associated with this event. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please send a private chat message directly to the host. Regarding the chat, please use the chat box to send a chat message to the host, a panelist, or another attendee. Click the menu icon in the upper right corner of the chat pod. Choose Start Chat With, then select hosts, presenters, or a specific attendee you'd like to contact. Type your message into the text box. Hit Enter or click the message bubble icon to send. We'd like you to help us count today. If you are participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute to go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you're viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. Again, our webinar today is on girls and the juvenile justice system. I am your facilitator, Kathy Manning, Program Manager for the National Girls Initiative. And our presenters today are Administrator Robert Listenby and Senior Advisor Catherine Pierce. Just want to mention that our webinar is scheduled for 1 hour today. It is an audio-only format, so we have the chat available to you to pose your questions. As questions come to mind, please feel free to post your question in the chat box, and we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. We will have a link available within the next few weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, and you can also check out other previous webinars there. Our agenda today is that we will cover the following learning objectives. For participants to become familiar with some of the issues that bring girls into contact with the juvenile justice system, to learn about the policy guidance that OJJDP has released related to girls, to learn about OJJDP's National Girls Initiative, and to have an opportunity to ask questions and learn what can be done to improve responses to girls in or at risk of entering the system. I just want to mention that this is the first in a series of webinars we will be presenting through the National Girls Initiative. The next webinar in our series will be on May 24th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Countering School Pushout and the Criminalization of Girls of Color. This webinar, featuring Dr. and author Monique Morris, will examine the pathways to school pushout and confinement for girls of color, particularly African American girls, who are consistently overrepresented in school discipline categories. There will be more information about upcoming webinars towards the end of this session. I'm honored to introduce our two presenters today, Administrator Robert Listenby and Senior Advisor to the Administrator, Catherine Pierce. Administrator Listenby was appointed by President Obama in 2013. Before his appointment to OJJDP, Mr. Listenby was Chief of the Juvenile Unit of the Defender Association of Philadelphia for 16 years and was a trial lawyer with the association for 27 years. In this capacity, he was instrumental in developing a drug court, a delinquency dependency crossover court, and a graduated response court. These specialty court programs helped to divert youth out of the juvenile justice system and reduce their risk of residential placement. Mr. Listenby was also a member of the Pennsylvania Interbranch Commission for Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Fairness, and helped create the Juvenile Defender Association of Pennsylvania, the first organization in the Commonwealth to establish a community of juvenile defenders focused on the interests of practitioners serving children and youth. He also served for a decade on the Philadelphia Disproportionate Minority Contact Working Group that created a curriculum used at the Philadelphia Police Academy to help improve relations between youth and law enforcement. Catherine Pierce is Senior Advisor to the Administrator. In her capacity as a Senior Advisor at OJJDP, she staffed the Attorney General's National Task Force on Children Exposed to Violence and the Attorney General's Advisory Committee on American Indian and Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence. Prior to coming to OJJDP, Catherine was the acting director of DOJ's Office on Violence Against Women, where she served as the deputy director for 15 years. While there, Catherine oversaw the development and implementation of multiple grant programs created by the Violence Against Women Act, and she directed OVW's Technical Assistance Initiative. Catherine currently leads OJJDP's policy work on children exposed to violence, trauma, girls and the juvenile justice system, and domestic child sex trafficking. My thanks to both Administrator Listenby and to Catherine for presenting this webinar today, and thanks to all of you for joining us. With that, I'll turn it over to Administrator Listenby.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for participating in this webinar regarding girls and criminal justice. Today, we will be highlighting the Office of Juvenile Justice and Prevention in Girls and the National Girls Initiative. I am Bob Listenby, Administrator of the Department of Justice's Office of Juvenile Justice and the Links to Prevention. First, I would like to acknowledge our facilitator, Kathy Manning, a program manager here at the Office of Juvenile Justice and the Links to Prevention. I would also like to acknowledge my co-presenter and senior advisor, Catherine Pierce. We would like to thank and acknowledge the American Institute for Research and the National Crittenden Foundation, our collaborators on the National Girls Initiative, or NGI. Before I delve into the specifics of our policy guides on girls and NGI, I want to briefly tell you about our agency and just why this issue is so important to us. OJJDP envisions a nation where all of our children are healthy, educated, and free from violence, and where if they come into contact with the juvenile justice system, that contact is rare, fair, and beneficial to them. Our agency focuses on a wide range of activities, not only to prevent from becoming involved in the system, but also to protect our most vulnerable citizens, our children, from victimization. Other OJJDP priorities include addressing the core protections outlined in the Juvenile Justice and the Links to Prevention Act, which established our office, deinstitutionalization of youth with status offenses, jail removal, sight and sound separation, addressing disproportionate minority contact, and reducing racial and ethnic disparities, reducing out-of-home placement, and comprehensive juvenile justice reform in states. Unfortunately today, as many of you know, nearly 30% of young people arrested are girls or young women. And their share of arrests, detainment, and court cases has steadily increased over the past 2 decades. These are often girls of color, girls living in poverty, and girls who have been victims of violence, including physical and sexual abuse. They are typically nonviolent and pose little or no risk to public safety. And their involvement with the juvenile justice system usually does more harm than good. OJJDP is acutely aware of its responsibility to address the needs of system-involved girls and young women, and we recognize that the juvenile justice reform efforts that we're involved in must fully consider the role of gender. Last October, after a year in the making, our agency made its largest step forward on behalf of girls at risk and system-involved girls and young women by releasing our policy guidance on girls and the juvenile justice system. The policy was the result of hard work of many of you in the field, along with OJJDP staff, the staff of OJJDP's National Girls Initiative, and we hope it will guide both our office and the field for many years to come. We encourage those who have not done so to please visit our website and give us your thoughts, your feedback and ideas, including additional ways we can approach implementation. In reviewing our detainment data and other relevant research, we delineated the following key issues impacting girls in detention. First, intersectional disparities, the gender gap, trauma, family violence, sexual exploitation, pregnant and parenting girls, girls' health risks and needs, and school failure. The policy guidance discusses the many reasons why its intentional focus on girls' issues is so important. With regard to intersectional disparities, girls and young women of color are continually overrepresented in the system. Race, gender, and class increase the risk of girls and young women becoming system involved. In addition to being overrepresented, girls of color are more likely to be referred to juvenile court, formally petitioned to court, detained, adjudicated, and also lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and intersex youth often experience systemic disparities and are twice as likely to be arrested and convicted and have 7 times the rate of youth on youth victimization in juvenile facilities. With regard to the gender gap, according to our 2013 residential placement data, most system-involved girls are nonviolent and pose little or no threat to public safety. 37% of girls versus 25% of boys are detained for status offenses and technical violations. 21% of girls versus 12% of boys are detained for simple assault and public order offenses. And in actuality, these girls have significant, complex, and pressing needs. System involvement for those posing little or no threat to public safety is often harmful, re-traumatizing, and reduces opportunities for positive development. With regard to trauma, justice-involved girls and young women have been widely victimized by violence. They have witnessed violence and are often criminalized for behaviors related to the resulting trauma. According to our survey of youth in residential placement, girls experience greater rates of violence compared to peers. 42% report past physical abuse, 44% report past suicide attempts, and 35% report past sexual abuse. The Northwestern Juvenile Project reports that girls who have been detained are 5 times more likely than their peers to die before age 29, 9 times more likely than Latinas, of causes including homicide, drug overdose, motor vehicle and other accidents, and suicide. With regard to family violence, the rise and arrest of girls and young women for assault between 1992 and 2012 has been partially attributed to the rise in state and local mandatory and pro-arrest policies for domestic violence. Arrest for simple or aggravated assault has increased for girls and young women. In 1992, girls accounted for 16% of the simple assault and 24% of aggravated assault arrests. In 2012, females accounted for 26% of simple assault and 37% of aggravated assault arrests. Mandatory and pro-arrest policies for domestic violence were originally passed in response to intimate partner violence, not as a response to intra-family disputes or family conflict between children and other family members. With regard to sexual exploitation, a 2013 report by the Institute of Medicine commissioned by OJJDP found that commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking of minors should be understood as acts of abuse and violence against children and adolescents. It's really important to understand this point. Therefore, our policy recommendation is to treat children who are sexually exploited or sex trafficked as victims, not criminals, and grant them safe harbor in facilities that address their unique needs. Unfortunately, however, most states still allow minors to be charged, detained, and prosecuted for prostitution-related offenses. Girls are disproportionately victims of commercial sexual exploitation, and girls account for the majority of youth arrested for prostitution and commercial vice. With regard to pregnant and parenting girls, we know that research has increased, services and programs are needed. That is, research is needed, and additional research and services and programs are needed. According to the survey of youth in residential placement, 9% of girls have children compared to 6% of female youth in the general population. 5% of girls in placement are pregnant. Let's talk for a moment about health risk and needs. Girls in the juvenile justice system present with complex health needs. According to that same Northwestern Juvenile Project study on girls, 75% had one or more psychiatric disorders. 47% have substance abuse disorders. Still more suffer from sexually transmitted diseases, serious illness, and have substantial vision, dental, and hearing problems. Let's talk again for a moment about school failure. School-based policies and practice marginalize girls of color, girls with disabilities, and LGBTQI youth. girls have higher rates of out-of-school suspension and expulsion, which increases their vulnerability for system involvement. For the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, committing to address the unique concerns of system-involved girls and youth means the following: recognizing their diverse pathways into and across the system, reducing system involvement and reliance on confinement for girls who pose no serious threat to public safety, and increasing the use of community and system programs that are gender and culturally responsive, trauma-informed, and developmentally appropriate. Our guidance delineates 8 focus areas where we think states, tribes, and local communities can improve their responses to girls. I would like the states, local facilities and programs, and tribes to really focus on these 8 areas: prohibiting detainment of girls for status offenses and sexual exploitation or domestic minor sex trafficking, phasing out the use of the valid court order, amending mandatory and pro-arrest policy for domestic violence so they can only apply to intimate partner violence between adults, fully implementing the Prison Rape Elimination Act, developing and increasing use of alternatives to confinement, taking a developmental approach when working with girls, addressing housing, education, health, family, relationships, and, of course, safety, identifying and addressing the needs of dual system involved girls. And by dual system, we mean those who are in contact with both the child welfare and the juvenile justice system, and increasing competence to address the needs of girls in or at risk of entering the juvenile justice system, including girls who are the children of incarcerated parents, young mothers, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, questioning intersex youth, survivors of domestic child sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, and girls who have experienced significant levels of school suspension, expulsion, or academic failure. OJJDP has employed a 3-pronged strategy to meet our commitment to these girls and young women: providing financial support through grants and cooperative agreements. This week, we will be issuing a solicitation devoted to improving the juvenile justice system's response to girls. We encourage you to check out our website to learn more about that exciting funding opportunity. Conducting research and data collection, and providing training and technical assistance. We have also already begun honing in on the concerns of girls and young women through work we are doing to address solitary confinement and reducing out-of-home placement. As regards solitary confinement, in response to a direct request from President Obama to Attorney General Loretta Lynch, the Department of Justice conducted a review of the use of solitary confinement across American prisons. After extensive study, the Department of Justice released its report in January, which included various policy recommendations and more than 50 guiding principles intended as best practices for correctional facilities across America. The principles address the treatment of certain categories of inmates, including pregnant women and LGBTQI inmates. As I've already stated, many girls and young women are led to system involvement as a result of witnessing and experiencing violence, resulting trauma, poverty, and racial and ethnic and gender bias. As administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, I want you to know that I'm committed to ensuring real justice for girls and young women in this country, so that we have enough time to respond to any questions or comments that you have. I'll now turn the webinar over to my senior advisor, Catherine Pierce. Catherine?
Thank you, Bob. As Bob has so thoroughly laid out, OJJDP is indeed committed to doing all we can on behalf of girls and young women. To help implement the policy Bob discussed, OJJDP created the National Girls Initiative. To give you a brief history, in 2010, OJJDP supported the National Girls Institute to elevate the field's understanding of girls in or at risk of entering the juvenile justice system, and to assist states, tribes, and local communities in their efforts to develop effective gender-responsive programs. In 2014, OJJDP changed the name of the National Girls Institute to the National Girls Initiative to reflect the need for concrete action on behalf of girls. The National Girls Initiative is currently administered by the American Institutes of Research in partnership with the National Crittenden Foundation. The purpose of NGI is to advance OJJDP's efforts to meet its commitments to address girls' needs, support innovative state, tribal, and local approaches in support of girls through NGI Innovation Awards, provide training and technical assistance to the field and to the innovation awardees. Renaming and retooling NGI help to build momentum in the field, create stronger stakeholder networks, and support program development that will improve the system and create lasting change on behalf of girls and young women. Today, I want to focus on some of the ways that NGI and OJJDP, working together, support our commitment to girls and young women. First, we host roundtables. We bring together leaders in the juvenile justice system, advocates, researchers, and diverse experts from around the country to promote greater understanding of girls and young women in the system, to foster collaboration across the nation, to identify and address emerging issues and challenges, and to identify priorities and gaps in our knowledge and data systems. For example, two years ago, we hosted a roundtable to surface current and key issues relevant to girls in the juvenile justice system. The policy guidance that Bob just discussed was a result of what we learned at that roundtable. 2 months ago, NGI, OJJDP, and the Office on Violence Against Women convened a roundtable to discuss the unintended consequences of mandatory and pro-arrest policies for domestic violence on girls and young women. The purpose of this gathering was to examine data from a number of states and counties showing high proportions of arrests and detention for girls for inter-family conflict, to foster collaboration between juvenile justice advocates, advocates for girls, and advocates for victims of domestic violence, and to gather information for an NGI paper that will define the problem for the field, propose shared terminology, summarize the current situation, and offer policy and practice recommendations for reform. Additional NGI-sponsored roundtables and webinars are also in the works, and they will address special topics and emerging issues. Future roundtables include one on American Indian and Alaska Native girls and the federal, state, and tribal juvenile justice systems, girls and school suspensions, expulsions, and truancy, young mothers, and girls' courts. The NGI webinar series, of which this is the first, will include Girls and School Pushout, featuring author and advocate Dr. Monique Morris, Girls and Trauma, featuring one of the nation's leading experts on women and girls and trauma, Stephanie Covington, Gender Injustice, featuring law professor and author of Gender Injustice, Francine Sherman, and Domestic Violence and Juvenile Justice, featuring Francine Sherman with a summary of what NGI learned from our roundtable on mandatory and pro-arrest policies for domestic violence. As mentioned earlier, NGI has also made innovation awards to support state, tribal, and local girls' coalitions, alliances, and collaborative efforts. All awards are doing exceptional work in 3 priority areas: collaborating with state juvenile justice specialists, state advisory groups, local government, and tribal councils, developing community-driven innovative approaches to reducing the arrest and detention of girls, and very importantly, implementing gender-specific, culturally responsive, trauma-informed, strengths-based, and developmentally appropriate approaches to working with girls. All of the innovation awardees are receiving technical assistance through NGI. 3 innovation awards were made with OJJDP funding: the Alliance for Girls in San Francisco, the Regional Youth and Adult Social Action Partnership in Connecticut, and the Iowa Task Force for Young Women. The Novo Foundation made 4 additional innovation awards to the following original applicants: the Education Law Center in Pennsylvania, the National Compadres Network in California, Southwest Key in Texas, and the PUA Foundation in partnership with the Hawaii Girls Court. Additional innovation awards will be announced this summer. So now we have talked enough, and at this time, we'd like to hear from you. To take us to our Q&A portion, I'd like to turn over the webinar to our facilitator, Kathy Manning.
Thank you, Catherine and Bob. And again, as a reminder, I'd like to encourage you at this time to be posting any questions you have in the chat box there. We have received some questions already, which we will address, and I want to encourage you to continue to post your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So we have a question. Can you talk more about the myth of more violent girls?
This is Catherine. I think when we heard that more girls were coming into the system, the assumption was made that more girls were becoming violent. But in fact, obviously, the opposite is the case. What we've learned through our work in the last year and last several years with NGI and here at OJJDP is, as Bob stated, most girls in the system pose no threat to public safety, and they come into the system for reasons that have very little to do with violence. I hope that has answered your question.
Let me add, based upon personal experience as a public defender for 27 years, one of the things I found is that, and I supervise, by the end of my career, 25 lawyers who are working on thousands of cases every year. And most of the girl cases that were coming in for simple assault. And most of the simple assault cases involve conflict between girls and girls in schools or between girls and parents. And these are the kinds of disputes that we think that there are alternative ways of addressing rather than bringing them into the juvenile justice system through diversions and prevention programs. And also, what we found is this very clear issue. Oftentimes, girls are coming into the system because they've experienced trauma. And what's needed is a way of screening for that trauma and addressing that trauma before it's escalated into the kinds of conflicts that bring them into our juvenile justice system. And so we're hoping that many of the approaches that we're taking across the nation will help folks in every school where we have children, wherever they come in contact with our public system, that they can be screened for the traumas that they might have experienced, and that they can receive the appropriate trauma-informed care so that that won't need to be escalated into juvenile justice.
Thank you. Next, we have two questions asking, would it be possible to provide the citations for the statistics being presented, especially in a couple of particular slides?
Yes, we'll be making the OJJDP's girls policy guidance available to everyone who participated, and the policy guidance is annotated, and the citations are all there.
And just as a reminder, the policy guidance that Catherine is referring to, which is annotated with the citations for these statistics, you'll find that policy guidance is in the handouts pod. So if you look, there are two items in the handouts pod. One is this PowerPoint, OJJDP's National Girls Initiative PowerPoint, and the second is Policy Guidance Girls and the JJ System, and you are welcome to download those at this time. Next question, what have the presenters learned about the effectiveness of girls' courts?
We think the jury is out on the effectiveness of girls' courts. In fact, there are so many different kinds of girls' courts around the country. They vary from community to community, from judge to judge. Some focus on girls who have been sexually exploited. Some focus on all girls who come to the attention of the court. And what we are trying to do is learn more about the diversity of girls' courts, and we'll be having a roundtable to really learn more about the success that some of those courts have enjoyed and some of the challenges that they've experienced. At the very most, we certainly don't want girls' courts to potentially pull more girls into the system, but rather divert them. So we are still learning, but as I said, we will be sponsoring a roundtable in the fall where we can really begin to learn from those judges and others in communities that sponsor girls' courts? Thanks for the question.
Our next question is, if you could choose just one policy change to push when it comes to girls and the juvenile justice system, what would it be?
This is Bob, and I think that what we've learned about systems is that if we can narrow the front door to the juvenile justice system and keep young people out, boys and girls, but especially girls, then we can do a lot better job because a couple of things. First of all, a lot of these cases that bring girls into the system, and I mentioned simple assault earlier, really are cases that can be addressed through prevention programs and through diversion programs that are well developed and for which there are many in our community. Also, what we know is that once young people get drawn into the juvenile justice system, they tend to go deeper into the system. And we know that lots of young girls are ending up in our deep-end facilities because they get into the systems and they have mental health issues and substance abuse issues, which are then amplified by the policies we have that govern these kinds of institutions. So if we can narrow the front door, that would be one of the policies I would really stress and I would encourage people to pursue, recognizing that the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act states specifically that status offenders should not be brought into the juvenile justice system. Yet we're still getting, in our deep-end facilities, up to 5% of the people who are there for status offenders. So I'd ask you to consider that as one of the main policy initiatives that you should consider.
And I would simply add that I think keeping girls with their extended families and in their communities makes a lot more sense than placing them in confined facilities.
Our next question is, can you explain more fully what you mean by phasing out the use of valid court orders?
Under the current Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, if a young person, male or female, comes into the court for a status offense, if they're truants, if they're a runaway, and they come to court, and a judge says to that child, I am ordering you to go back home and stay with your parents and do not run away again, and the child then leaves home for whatever reason, that child is in violation of the judge's judicial order. If the court orders a child who is a status offender to perform community service, or court orders a child who is a status offender to engage in a mentoring program but the child does not, once the child fails to obey the order from the court, that is a violation of a valid court order, assuming that the order was made consistent with the rules and regulations governing orders by judges in a given jurisdiction. Once the child has violated the valid court order, that child can be detained in a detention facility. That child can also be sent to a deep-end facility and can be held for periods governed by the standards in a particular given state. So that happens to up to 5% of our children who are in detention in our nation based upon statistics that we have. And we think that using valid court orders is not an appropriate approach to addressing issues, particularly since many of the issues are arising because of behavior that is pure adolescent behavior, the kinds of things that children do, and we are criminalizing that kind of behavior. So I think it's important to recognize that. I'd add that the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Orders, Family Court Judges rather, has also expressed strong support for ending valid court orders. And I believe that the judges across our nation have a pretty good idea of where we ought to be going with that kind of a policy initiative. Thank you.
Our next question is, how do you account for the increase in the number of simple and aggravated assaults from 1992 to 2012?
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but in large part, our data shows that these are inter-family disputes, inter-family conflict, resulting in pro-arrest or mandatory arrest for one of the quote-unquote perpetrators of the violence. Those are policies that were established by many states and localities, police departments, that required that a primary aggressor for domestic violence be arrested. In fact, what we know in these cases is that girls are being arrested for fighting with another family member, very often their mother, and they're being arrested in a way that was originally intended for the primary aggressor in an intimate partner violence event. So, in fact, girls are being arrested for something that actually we feel should be we feel alternative policies need to be developed at the local level, and that's what the paper that we referred to will address. We're working with consultants with NGI now to determine what that paper, what some of those recommendations will be, but we feel like this is an area that is really needed for reform.
And I want to add on the statistical side a couple of basic things. First, juvenile crime is down, and it's down substantially over the last 2 decades. Violent juvenile crime is down over the last couple of decades. The number of children in out-of-home placement has been reduced by over 50% since 2001, thanks to really aggressive policy initiatives by the states, and we commend the states for doing that. So when we say that the percentage of girls being arrested is increasing, that absolute number is in fact going down because the number of kids coming into our system is going down. But the percentage of girls is actually going up as a part of that overall number. So it's important to recognize that distinction. And again, we want to commend the states and counties across the nation for aggressively addressing juvenile justice policies and practices and producing some really good results.
Our next question is there a schedule available for the upcoming webinar series mentioned in the NGI portion? Yes, so we have several upcoming webinar sessions scheduled. I mentioned on May 24th, the school push-out with Dr. Monique Morris. Catherine mentioned some other upcoming webinars. We have the Girls and Trauma with Stephanie Covington on June 7th. We have the Gender Injustice webinar with Francine Sherman on June 21st, and Domestic Violence and Juvenile Justice with Francine Sherman on July 13th. So please stay tuned. Look for announcements coming out with the exact times of those webinars as well as the registration links so you can participate in those. The next question is, what can we do to address the C-sex girls as they turn 18? We see a high number of women 18 to 26 who are now in the criminal adult system but were child victims.
This is an excellent question and something that I think the country has a lot of work to do. There is no one pat response, but we have seen tremendous progress in some communities where there is a recognition that girls and boys are exploited at a very early age, and then there is nothing magic that necessarily happens at the age of 18. I think what we would like to see is more work in this area where there's best practice, best response. We often turn to people in Compton, California, who run the STAR Court, and feel that their approach to responding to girls is very positive, and that their approach to working with young women on probation is very positive. And I guess the one thing I would add, and I think I'll ask Bob to say more about, is that what we know is that if we have a developmentally appropriate approach to juvenile justice reform, we know that the brain does not fully develop until somebody is in their 20s. And so to hold young people responsible for certain actions just because they magically turn 18 does not make a whole lot of sense in the scheme of a developmental approach to juvenile justice reform.
I have to say I'm very excited about recent developments in dealing with girls under the age of 18 and those over the age of 18 in the area of commercial sexual exploitation, because I've talked to many prosecutors and law enforcement representatives who've indicated that they have begun the process of treating them as victims and survivors and not seeing them as criminals. And we think that this is a major step forward, and we're looking forward to working with law enforcement and prosecutors as we go forward to address, provide guidance and support for their efforts in recognizing this. But we've raised this issue repeatedly when we're in law enforcement programs and activities, and we're optimistic that that more law enforcement members are better understanding this and will be able to continue to address this issue across the nation.
This next question we have addressed some since the question came in, but I'll raise it in case there's more that we want to add. You stated that the girls are not being incarcerated at a high rate for violent crimes. What are the main crimes the girls are being incarcerated for?
Prostitution-related offenses, domestic violence or /family violence, for school-related offenses, and for truancy, status offenses, including truancy and running away, and substance use and other drug offenses.
Our next question is, which age and level of justice involvement should diversion programs ideally target to prevent girls from deeper involvement in the system?
Well, I don't have the data here right in front of me, and nor do I have the research at my fingertips. But what I know, based upon what we've read on the issue, is that diversion across the board as early as possible is really a good idea. Now, diversion to what is the real question? And we're asking folks in our efforts to reform juvenile justice across the nation that young people be diverted through prevention programs, that young people be diverted in ways where they have their opportunities for risk and needs assessment. In looking at the needs assessments, recognizing that according to data in our research, that over 60% of the young people who come into the juvenile justice system have diagnosable mental health disorders. Over 50% have substance abuse disorders. We are encouraging our colleagues and across the nation to come in contact with girls to make sure that diversions are the places where these needs can be addressed. We know from that Northwestern Juvenile Project that a substantial percentage of young people who come into our juvenile justice system come in, get diagnosed, and leave the system without ever having their needs addressed. And we must find ways to address their needs, because otherwise recidivism becomes an issue. And we're trying our best to find ways to do that. The other thing I want to emphasize is that to the extent possible, as our colleagues develop diversion programs across the country, if you can work to develop a research component with that so that we can determine what the results of those diversions are, that would be very helpful, because as we find out what is really working in a diversion area, we can share that with the rest of the nation through JUJES and other kinds of communication tools we have, so that we can learn from one another. So much of what's happening in reducing out-of-home placement is based on what we're learning from states in terms of what the states are doing. We know that we've looked at lots and lots of state studies, and that we are encouraging folks across the nation to reduce out-of-home placement based upon what we've learned from those state studies. So we want to encourage research regarding diversion.
Our next question is, can you comment further on youth who are dually involved, meaning involved in both the juvenile justice and the child welfare systems?
This is one of the most exciting areas of practice that I'm familiar with. And again, we have colleagues like Shea Bilczek and others who have been doing a lot of work in this area and who have a lot more information about this issue than I do at the present time. What I can say for those of you who are not familiar with what we call dual system youth or children in the delinquency dependency crossover program is that when you witness a program and you go into a court area where a dependency court in particular, that you are involved in a hearing that is an extraordinarily complex undertaking. I have been involved in these hearings. I've had as many as 18 different people at the bar of the court, 4 or 5 lawyers. We have guardians ad litem. You have social workers. You have parents. You have lawyers for parents and so forth, all at the bar of the court. It's a complex undertaking. And what I've found and what I've encouraged is this. We know that oftentimes the child welfare system has many alternatives available to young people that do not stigmatize the young people. It does not bar them from getting jobs. And we encourage, to the extent that I've been able to work in this system, that young people who have dependency issues or child welfare issues be diverted back to that system so that they can take advantage of the opportunities that are available there and also not have the stigma attached to a juvenile record. So in programs that I've worked with, they've included diverting young people back to the child welfare system, making arrangements so that once they've adjusted to that system, and this is in cooperation and collaboration with prosecution, to have their records expunged and have them go back into that system so that they can achieve real independence to that system and appreciate the various kinds of resources that are available. So again, divert them back to the child welfare system, whether they were in the system before or not, divert them if they have those child welfare needs, and then discharge the juvenile case, and then, where appropriate, under the circumstances and rules of the given state jurisdiction, have those records expunged, and then young people will not have the stigma of a juvenile record attack.
Our next question is, what type of support is OJJDP currently providing to the field for program evaluation, research, and policy reform that is specific to the needs of girls and young women? Does OJJDP anticipate increases in funding for these types of efforts in the future?
We currently have posted on our website a solicitation that is devoted to evaluation of trauma-informed care in juvenile justice settings, and it specifies a request for proposals that address trauma-informed programs for girls. We also have a program called FIRE, Field Initiated Research and Evaluation, where in the past we've received really excellent proposals that we've been able to support that address programs related to girls and LGBTQI young people.
Our next question is, given OJJDP's current focus on developmentally appropriate programs and services, are there any examples of how this approach is being translated in the field that addresses the specific needs of girls and young women? What OJJDP resources are available to support the development of such programs in the field?
I would ask people to turn to or look into some of the programs that we mentioned earlier that received innovation awards, the Girls Alliance in San Francisco, the Iowa Task Force on the Status of Women, RIASAP in Connecticut, National Compadres and Luxteen in California, PUA Foundation in collaboration with the Hawaii Girls Court, the Education Law and Policy Center in Pittsburgh, and Southwest Key in Texas. I also want to reiterate that Bob, in his remarks, hit upon the fact that there will be a solicitation forthcoming in this week, and what we will send a link to that solicitation to everyone who's participated in this webinar, and we ask you to look for that. But this will be an opportunity for states and localities to begin to address this issue in a way that is community-driven and is responsive to your own community needs and values.
We have time for one or two remaining questions. The next question is there any information available regarding the children of expectant and parenting girls in the system, primarily regarding their overall well-being and outcomes? Also, is there information available regarding the reproductive health care these girls receive?
I think probably the National Crittenden Foundation is an excellent resource if you go to their website, the National Crittenden Foundation. But there are also programs that are supported and information and materials that have been developed by the CDC. And we can actually follow up and provide links to on that particular matter to people who've participated. We also will be sponsoring an NGI roundtable on pregnant and parenting young women, and hope to learn a lot more about what is available and what is out there and what can be replicated.
Our next question is, what areas do you see as high priority for better data collection and research?
We are, of course, make every possible effort to develop policies based upon data, upon practices that have been researched, and that give us a clear idea of what really is working and what is not working in the field. So we're encouraging data collection on a wide range of issues, and we're encouraging research on a wide range of issues. As regards girls specifically, as I indicated earlier, diversion programs are a prime area for us to do research on. We're looking at particularly youth law enforcement diversion programs that are pre-arrest diversion programs. We're looking at civil citations to understand how those are working and the extent to which the diversions actually prevent young people from coming back into the system. We're also looking at deep end facilities. There's not a lot known based upon what I've been able to research and find about the results of deep end facilities. We know that recidivism is a problem in our nation for most of our juvenile justice deep end programs, that the rates of recidivism run from 30% up to 60 and 70%. And we think that there are better ways of addressing the needs and the issues and risks associated with young people going to our deep end facilities so that we can reduce recidivism. So those are areas that I think are prime for further research, and we look forward to others who want to engage in this research. Again, some of it will be funded by OJJDP. Some of it will be funded by other research programs within the Department of Justice. Some will be funded by other programs in other federal government and state government organizations. We look to combine that research and share it so that we can all learn from the experiences of one another across the nation.
Thank you. We have just a minute or two left to cover some resources and final points before I turn it back to Administrator Listenby to close us out this afternoon. But I want to thank you for your questions. We're so pleased that you all have participated and been engaged in this conversation, and appreciate the thoughtful questions on these topics. I want to highlight a few resources. As we mentioned, the Girls and the Juvenile Justice System Policy Guidance is both in the handout pod. You could download there, or if you wish, you could go to the website, www.ojjdp.gov/programs/girls-at-risk.html. A web page everyone's probably intimately familiar with and very interested in, OJJDP funding information, www.ojjdp.gov/funding/funding.html. Of course, the OJJDP website, www.ojjdp.gov, and the National Girls Initiative, www.nationalcrittenton.org/whatwedo/National Girls Initiative. We do have an evaluation, which will be accessible at the conclusion of this webinar, and I really want to encourage you to take a moment to fill out that evaluation and give us feedback on today's session. We appreciate your feedback on that. As we mentioned at the beginning, this webinar has been recorded and will be archived on OJJDP's online university. Please visit www.ojjdpou.org. For more information, please feel free to contact NTTAC, who has hosted our webinar today, www.nttAC.org, that's the National Training and Technical Assistance Center, as well as, again, OJJDP at www.ojjdp.gov. And I'll turn it over for conclusion to Administrator Listenby for some closing comments.
Once again, I'd like to thank you for taking the time that you've taken to join us today. A few comments. Reforming Juvenile Justice, a Developmental Approach by the National Academy of Science is a report that we focus on and moving forward regarding all efforts for reforming juvenile justice. Secondly, trauma, which we learned a great deal about from the Attorney General's National Task Force Report on Children Exposed to Violence, is a major resource for us in determining where we're going. In addition, the model program guide that we have along with crimesolutions.gov tells us what works and what doesn't work. If you're looking for programs and you want to find out what's working that we know about, you'll find it up on the model programs guide. And we add new programs to the model programs guide, about 20 of them every year. So we're looking for new programs that are really working. As we're going forward with reform, we believe that youth voices are critical to what we do. We want to hear from young people, and we try and involve young people in almost everything that we do regarding what's going forward. In addition, we engage families, and we want family participation. There are 4 things that I think I want to stress that young people have been telling us. First, the focus should shift from what's wrong with a child to hearing about what's happened to a child. We've heard that reframing. We think that's critical. In addition, we were just in a gathering with a young person just last week, and they emphasized this. If I'm a runaway and police pick me up, we want law enforcement and everybody else to ask the question, why am I running away? Don't just take me back to the same place where I was, which there might be a lot of reasons there that would drive any young person away. Finally, young people have told me 3 things that are important that I try and stress whenever I get a chance to speak. First, young people want somebody to believe in them. Young people want people who will never give up on them. And young people want somebody who will go above and beyond the call of duty in order to help them get to the next stage of life and have productive lives. So I'd like you to remember some of those things as you go forward and help us if you have good ideas about what we can do. Thank you very much, and again, thank you for joining.
The host has left the meeting. So at this time, the meeting